All right, we're starting Mark chapter 15 this morning. We finished up chapter 14 in our last study. Of course, we're talking about Peter and his denial of Jesus. And chapter 15 brings us to the second part of Jesus' trial. And so he, of course, was betrayed at night and arrested by the soldiers who came to gather him, and was taken before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, in a complete mockery of justice. They violated so many of their own laws and the law of Moses in the things that they did to Jesus. It wasn't anywhere close to being fair or honest. Yet they claimed to be fair and honest people. But their envy against Jesus was so great that they had committed themselves to doing whatever they had to get rid of him. And so they had this mock kind of trial where they basically took Jesus alone by himself, away from anybody who could defend him, but also away from any kind of counselor or anything like that, and hurled accusations at him, hoping that he would admit to something or say something that they could use to entrap him and use against him. And all that is recorded for us in Mark's account that Jesus said was that he admitted that he was the Christ, the Son of God, and that he would come on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven in judgment on Jerusalem and on the Jewish nation. They called that blasphemy, and they said that's enough to make him worthy of death. And so now they're going to try to make this legal. So the Jews at this time, the Jewish lands, Judea, were occupied by Rome, and the Roman government had authority over those lands. And so they would allow the Jews to try certain cases that had to do with matters of religion, matters of their practice of the Old Testament law, and things of that nature. But when it came to serious offenses, and especially a capital offense, something for which they were seeking the death penalty, that had to go through the Roman government. So Rome had kept the Jewish people from the right to execute criminals. They had to have Roman approval in order to do that. And so as badly as they would have liked to have just done all of this themselves under the cover of darkness and killed Jesus and been done with it, because of the Roman occupation, they had to go through the next part of the process, which was to take what they had gathered against Jesus before the Roman court, and in this case before Pilate, and to get his judgment on the matter concerning Jesus. So that's what the first part of Mark chapter 15 is about. And we'll start and read here, and then we'll look at a couple of the other accounts to notice a couple more details. But verse 1 says, "And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him," and you notice there, Mark, he's doing what he's done through his entire gospel account. He just jumps to the next point very quickly. The next thing, and then the next thing, it's a book of action. And so he tells us that in the morning, they all got together and said, came up with their plan of how we're going to take this before the Roman system. So the trial had been conducted at night, which was illegal. So they had to have another meeting, another gathering in the morning when it was daylight, so that it would be legal, not only for the Jewish system, but also for the Roman system. So they had already spent the night making their decision and coming up with their false accusations and all of those things, getting their story straight. So when the morning came and they came in for this session of court, everybody knew exactly, what was going to be said and what the verdict was, and it was all predetermined. And so they came together, they went through the motions and said, sure enough, we need to take this to Pilate. And so that's what they did. And notice again who it was in verse 1, the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and the whole council. So this is all of the Jewish leadership, the Sanhedrin, and pointing out here particularly the chief priests and so forth. So they're going to take Jesus to Pilate. Verse 2 says that Pilate asked him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And he answering said unto him, "Thou sayest it." And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, "Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee." But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. And so, again, Mark singles in on one question that Jesus did answer, and that was, again, the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And so when he'd been asked before the Jewish council, "Are you the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "I am." And when Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Thou sayest it," which means you've said it. What you said is right and correct. And so he answered the question correctly, of course, that he is the king of the Jews. And all the other things that were asked of him, the other accusations that were hurled at him, when those came, Jesus answered nothing. And Pilate marveled at this, and no doubt, in his time serving in this position, he had seen many trials and many criminals, many people who were guilty, making excuses for the accusations brought against them, or arguing against, the things that were said against them. Or even if it were a false accusation, they would probably be very vocal and strongly, oppose what was being said to them. But never anyone like Jesus, who answered nothing. And his answering nothing, of course, is powerful, because it shows, first of all, that he's not afraid of them. This entire system has nothing on him and can do nothing to him. And he will say that to Pilate in another account that we'll look at in just a minute. But the power here is in God's hands, and Jesus is completely submissive to God. And so he's not afraid of Pilate or of anyone else. And so let them say what they want to about him. That doesn't bother him. It doesn't cause him fear, to be afraid. On the other hand, it also shows that they had nothing against him. The reason he doesn't answer is because they had no evidence to present to convict him of anything. All they can do is shout accusations and hope that something sticks. But Jesus knows they have no case. There's no case to be made. He hasn't done anything wrong. And so what you hear in the silence of Jesus are these accusations coming from men of corrupt hearts, filled with envy, who are just trying to find some way to destroy him. And the longer you listen, the more obvious it becomes that they have nothing. They're morally bankrupt, and they're lying about this man because they hate him. And so Jesus doesn't have to say anything, because there's nothing against him, and because their words speak for themselves. And that's an important lesson to learn and to remember, because ultimately, when we stand before God on the day of judgment, it's our own words that will condemn us, or will show us to be, forgiven and right. By our own words will we be condemned. By our own actions will we be condemned. And it doesn't matter how much we may scream and cry and yell and whatever on that day. It is what it is. Our lives are what they are. We've lived how we lived. We said what we said. We've done what we've done. And on that day, God's just going to show us the record. Here's what my word said. Here's what you did. If you did what my word said, then everything is okay. If not, then it's not. And so Jesus is kind of demonstrating that principle here, that, the facts are the facts. And he's not going to argue with things that are blatantly false and dishonest. The other thing you hear in the silence of Jesus is the weakness of Pilate, that for all of these false accusations, and Pilate as a man in a position who knows how the system works, and who knows how justice is supposed to be served, and knows when somebody doesn't have a case, in spite of his knowledge of the innocence of Jesus, he's going to do a lot of talking to make excuses for himself, try to get off the hook, try to wash his hands of the situation. And what you hear in the silence is Pilate trying to find some way to justify himself in going along with something that he knows is not right. And again, his words condemn himself. He condemns himself with his own words, and Jesus doesn't have to say anything. You know, in John chapter 3, that great verse, of course, we all know in verse 16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. You know, Jesus goes on to say that he came into the world not to condemn, but to save. And the point of that is not that people aren't condemned, but Jesus didn't have to come into the world to condemn people. We were already condemned. And so he came into the world to help us see that and to show us the way of salvation. And the more silent he remains, the more Pilate condemns himself, the more the Jewish leadership condemn themselves, and in the end, their own words stand as the testimony against them. And it's true for us as well. And so God doesn't have to say anything on the day of judgment. He just has to open the book. And that's why he's given it to us, so we can find the way of salvation. So Jesus answered nothing, and Pilate is amazed by that. Now, verse 6 says that at the feast, he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye then that I shall do unto him whom ye call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. And so the story is, of course, that there was this tradition that, for whatever reason, had been developed, that at the feast time, the Feast of Passover, a prisoner would be released to the Jewish people. And so you have two options here. You have Jesus, of course, and then there's Barabbas. And we're told about Barabbas that he was bound, meaning he was in prison and in chains, because he had made an insurrection. And the insurrection, of course, is that he was leading Jewish people to try to overthrow the Roman government. So they were trying to cast off Roman power from them, and they had led this act of rebellion and had been arrested. And so in that insurrection, somebody had been killed. So Barabbas was a murderer. He was one who had participated in and seemingly led an insurrection against Rome. And we know also from the other accounts that he was a thief, a robber. So on one hand, you have Jesus, who never did any wrong, who only did good for others, who proved his deity by miracles and great acts of power. And then you have a thief who is a murderer and a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker, causing riots and things like that. And so who do you want released? And of course, the Jewish leadership, they call for Barabbas instead of Jesus, which again is a testimony to the corruption of their hearts, but also to the corruption of the process that they're going through on this occasion. It shows just how unjust this so-called trial was. And so they wanted Barabbas released instead of Jesus. So if you notice verse 8, it says that the multitude was crying out for Pilate to do what he usually did, release a prisoner to them. And so he says, which prisoner do you want? And verse 11 says that the chief priest moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. Now, there are two things to notice here. One is that this again demonstrates the trouble that people have been having with Jesus and with his teaching. They want a physical king over a physical kingdom. And that means you have to overthrow Rome. Jesus has made it clear that he's not there to lead a rebellion, an armed rebellion, to overthrow the Roman government. He's there to change hearts and minds of people, and by doing so, Rome will be overthrown. And it's going to take some time, but in a matter of, decades, Rome is going to stop persecuting Christianity and embrace it because of the preaching of the gospel. But Jesus was not leading a rebellion to overthrow the Roman government. Barabbas was. That's the kind of Messiah that they wanted, a physical king who would fight their battles for them and make them the dominant, nation on the earth. And again, as we've said so many times going through Mark's account of the gospel, there are still people today looking for that kind of leader and that kind of kingdom. And whether it's premillennialism and the idea of Jesus coming back to set up that kingdom, or Zionism that tries to remake the Old Testament nation of Israel in Israel today, whatever it is, that kind of thinking is the exact opposite of who Jesus is and what he came to do. And so they rejected him here because of that, and people are still rejecting him today for the same reasons. The difference today is they claim to follow him while they're rejecting him. They claim to follow him, by name, and they even wear the name Christian, but they don't follow his doctrine. So anyway, that's one thing to notice there. The other thing is that it was the Jewish leadership that moved the people to choose Barabbas. So the people, as we talked about, when Jesus first came into the city, they were, welcoming him with open arms. They were taking off their coats and tearing down the branches from the trees and putting them before him. They were not upset when he drove the money changers out of the temple. They weren't discouraged by the miracles that he performed. The common people gladly heard him and received him. And so the people, for the most part, were on Jesus' side. Not necessarily that they were faithful followers of his, but they didn't see any reason for him to be killed. He was doing a lot of good things. But when this trouble started and when the Jewish leadership, in order for their plan to succeed, it can't just be them saying Jesus needs to die. They have to get the people on their side. And that's what they've been trying to do all along, find some way to undermine Jesus. So he would do a miracle. They would say he did it by the power of Beelzebub. He's working for Satan. How can you trust him? He would do something good, and they would say, well, he came from Nazareth, and nothing good ever came from Nazareth. Whatever he did, they tried to undermine it. And eventually it's gotten to the point now where they, in this crowd, in this mob, where, there's all of this, chanting for Pilate to do what he's done before, they're able to use their influence to sway the people that Jesus needs to be the one to be crucified. And so it's through the Jewish leadership that the people are persuaded, moved, emotions take over, and they're not thinking rationally or clearly. They're just being moved by their emotion, and they're falling in with the crowd, and they're joining in with the chant, and it ends up with Jesus being crucified. And we always have to be aware of that and beware of that we're not allowing ourselves to be governed by our emotions, that we're not being swayed just because of who is telling us whatever, giving us information, but that we take what we hear and we search it out and find it to be true. And that's especially important, of course, when it comes to the Word of God, to Scripture, and to how we live our lives as Christians and what we believe and what we teach and what we practice. We can't just do it because somebody we respect told us to do it that way, or because the person on the television said it. It has to be because God's Word says it. And so we can't be governed by just emotions or feelings. We have to be guided by Scripture. And they were not here. They let their emotions take over. And the chief priest, knew what they were doing. They knew that people could be manipulated by their emotions to do things that normally they wouldn't do. in their right minds, they wouldn't have sought for Jesus to be crucified. But because of the heightened situation here, they're more easily swayed and persuaded to do that. So we always have to be on guard against emotionalism and letting emotion be the only thing that's guiding us. And so they called out for Barabbas to be released. Pilate asks, if I release Barabbas, what shall I do with Jesus? And their answer was, crucify him. And again, that starts with the Jewish leadership and spreads over to the people. And so again, they're persuading the people to call for Jesus' crucifixion. So the same people who only a week before were shouting Hosanna when he came into the city, and they were calling him the Son of David, these are the very same people who are now chanting, crucify him. And it's just that, it's a chant, and it's even kind of written that way in the original, that this becomes a chant from the crowd over and over. They're just, shouting, crucify him. And you've seen, we've seen a lot lately in the past few years of these mobs and these protests and how they'll get some slogan and they'll start chanting. And you may have seen, I have, I don't know if you have or not, but somebody will go up to these people in the crowd with a microphone and say, what are you here for? What are you standing for? What are you fighting against? They have no idea. They're just doing what the crowd's doing. They've fallen in with the crowd and they're saying those things, and they don't really know or understand why they're there. Not counting all the people who've been paid to be there. But nevertheless, that's what's happening here. It's a mob mentality. And again, we have to be aware of that and beware of that, because it's one of the ways that the devil works, through peer pressure, through, all of these people believe it's this way, and so I need to go along with them. I don't want to stand against them. So many people think it's right this way, so they must be right. We always have to come back to a foundation of truth. How do I know that this is true? What's the evidence that this is true? And not just, it's what the crowd says. So they're chanting for Jesus' death. Pilate asks, the important question, what evil has he done? If we're going to put this man to death, you ought to be able to tell me one evil thing that he has done. But they had no answer. All they answered was, crucify him, even louder. They couldn't name one evil thing he had done. So there was no reason for him to be arrested, much less tried, and certainly not to be crucified. Yet that's what they're chanting for. And Pilate knew, as we just read, that it was envy that motivated them to do this. They were envious of Jesus and wanted him out of the way. So Pilate wanted to content the people. He didn't want it to become a mob and get out of hand. And so he agreed to release Barabbas and then to crucify Jesus. Now Mark says when he had scourged him to be crucified, and we know that from the other accounts that Pilate initially hoped that scourging Jesus would be enough, to satisfy their desire for blood, and they would crucify him. But they, kept on, and he was crucified as well. It's also important to notice here just how simply and how briefly Mark tells us what's taking place. They cried out, crucify him. Pilate says, why? And they kept on, shouting and chanting, and it just says that he delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified. Those words are so short and so simple that it's easy to read that and not grasp the meaning that the scourging was not just, they scourged him, but, that was a matter of life and death. A Roman soldier could kill a person just by scourging, much less what followed with crucifixion. But the details of scourging and crucifixion are barely mentioned in the New Testament in the gospel accounts. And part of the reason for that is we know these things from history, and it was so common in those days that everybody knew what it meant when you said those words. But the other reason is because the predictions in the Old Testament are very specific and very descriptive. You read the 22nd Psalm, we read words about being able to see the bones of Jesus, not literally, but the way that he was crucified. You could tell all of his bones. We read about his hands and his feet being pierced. We read about his side being pierced. We read about all of this horrible suffering that he would go through in great detail in the prophecies, so that when you come to the New Testament, all you have to hear is he was scourged and crucified, and we know what that means, or at least we should if we've studied our Old Testament scriptures. And so the Jewish people obviously should have been aware of this and recognized what was happening and what was taking place. So I want to take just a minute and read a couple of things from a couple other accounts. Matthew 26, first of all, in verse 57. In the story here, in the passage, we've had the humility in Gethsemane, and we saw Jesus humbled and agonizing over what was to come. And now we come to the honesty of Gabbatha. And Matthew's account mentions this place in, let's say, chapter 26, down toward the end there, verse 57. It says, "They that had laid hand on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled." And, of course, Peter followed him afar off. Notice, under the high priest's palace, and then went in. Verse 59, "Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none." And so, again, this is the Jewish side of the trial. If you notice in verse 64, Jesus said, when they asked him, in fact, the priest there in verse 63 says, "I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." That was another violation of the law of Moses. The high priest was not to adjure people, to use God's name in causing people to testify against themselves especially. But Jesus answers, "Thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And of course the high priest tears his clothes. Verse 66, he says he's guilty of death. They spit in his face and buffeted him. Others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee?" And then we have Peter's denial. If you look at chapter 27 then, verse 1 is where we are in Mark 15. "When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate the governor." Here we have the account of Judas seeing what was happening, coming back and casting down the silver. And then verse 11 says that Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said unto him, "Thou sayest." And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, "Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee?" And he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now at that feast the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would, and they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, "Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ?" For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. Now notice verse 19. And this is one of the different parts that I wanted us to look at. It says, "When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man? For I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, "Whither of the twain will ye that I release unto you?" They said, "Barabbas." Pilate saith unto them, "What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ?" They all say unto him, "Let him be crucified." And the governor said, "Why? What evil hath he done?" But they cried out the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." Now notice verse 24. "When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." And so you have some details in Matthew's account that are worth noting. One, of course, is the message from Pilate's wife about her dreams, and she said, "You better not have anything to do with Jesus." And so Pilate knew that it was for envy they delivered him. He knew that Jesus had done nothing wrong, and now his wife is trying to convince him not to go along with this. But he did anyway. And notice his excuse. It says that he saw he could prevail nothing. Well, he's the governor, right? He could have done something if he really wanted to, but rather he saw it was going to be a mob, a tumult, a riot. And so he brings out this water and washes his hands as though that makes him innocent. Certainly it doesn't. He's still guilty, and he'll have to answer for his actions. But it's key to notice the next verse. When Pilate washed his hands and said, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person," they said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Those words are very important because, number one, it reveals the heart of the Jewish leadership and how far they had gone from God and from his word, how hardened their hearts had become, even toward Jesus. Again, this man who had done no wrong and had done no harm and had performed miracles and taught, truth and goodness, yet they're so set against him that they say his blood can be on us. We'll pay the price for his blood. And not only for us, they say, but even on our children. And so it shows where their hearts were. But secondly, it also, in doing that, reminds us of why God is going to do what he did to Jerusalem in AD 70. He destroyed Jerusalem and ended the Jewish system, that Jewish economy, because the blood of Christ was on them. And people get upset. And, I remember when that movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out, everybody was complaining that this movie blames the Jews for Jesus' death. And so it's anti-Semitic or whatever. They even, when that movie was released, this statement, "His blood be on us and our children," he didn't take it out of the movie, but that movie was done, everybody spoke in Arabic, and it had subtitles. So they said the words in Arabic, but he didn't write the words on the screen because people were upset because they're saying, "You're blaming the Jews for killing Jesus." Well, they did. It wasn't just them. The Romans also killed Jesus, and the truth is, we're all guilty. He died for your sins and for my sins, and if we hadn't sinned, he wouldn't have had to die. It's everybody's fault. But this was the end of a journey that they had been on for a long time of rebelling against God. And just like God destroyed the Canaanites after being patient with them and giving them time and opportunity to repent, and they refused, so he destroyed them, just like he destroyed the world at the time of the flood, just like he judged Babylon, and just like he judged Greece, and just like he judged Rome, he did the same to his own people, the nation of Israel. And he'd done it before when he took them into captivity, and he was very patient and merciful and brought them back. But now they've rejected his only begotten Son to the point that they've said, "His blood be upon us." And God doesn't take that lightly. And so he brought judgment upon them. And all of that, ties in with what's happening, not just here, but what's going to happen and what Jesus was talking about when he talked about coming in judgment on Jerusalem. And so it's an important part of the story. And, Pilate may claim to be innocent, but he's just as guilty as the others were in Jesus being crucified. But it's all working out according to God's plan to bring about the salvation of the world. And so while we're here, Jesus is, on trial, and he always, as he always did, he spoke honestly. When they asked him if he was the Messiah, he said that he was. When he was asked if he was king of the Jews, he said that he was. When he was questioned about the authority of Pilate in John chapter 19, verses 10 and 11, he said, "You wouldn't have any power except it come from above, from God." And, that's not something you want to say to a Pilate, to a Herod, to one of the leaders here, because they get upset and they'll kill you or whatever. But it was the truth, and Jesus told him the truth because he always was honest. And the point of that is, when his life was on the line, when everything was at stake, Jesus still told the truth, yet everybody around him is lying through their teeth. They're bearing false witness against him. They're getting these false accusations. Nobody is saying what is right and what is true. And so Jesus shines brightly in this example, and again, is the great example for us as well. So Lord willing, next time we'll talk about the crucifixion and what happens here when the sentence is executed upon Jesus, and talk a little bit about some of the details. We're out of time, so we'll stop here, and we'll pick up there next time.